Good afternoon, and welcome to the webinar of the Fiscal Calculator, Estimating the Fiscal Impacts of Development in the Greater Peoria Area. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We're presenting today the University of Illinois Extension Tri-County Regional Planning Commission and TESCA Associates, and we're glad to do so. Today, your facilitators are myself, Amy Ingalls, with the University of Illinois Extension, and I am a Community and Economic Development Educator. I serve Livingston, McLean, and Woodford counties. Also joining me as a facilitator is Jordan Elena. He is also with the University of Illinois Extension, and he is a Community and Economic Development Educator serving Bureau, LaSalle, Marshall, and Putnam counties. There are 15 additional community and economic development educators throughout the state of Illinois. They are serving communities in the capacity of leadership, organizational development, community economic development, and community participatory planning. Please take a moment to visit our website when you have time. We are presenting you this program under our program called E-Institute. It is a local government education program, and it is prepared for elected and appointed officials. And you can see the website there, and also we encourage you to visit that. And I'll just take a moment and let Jordan talk to you about that program. Jordan?
Thanks, Amy. As Amy said, this webinar is being presented as part of the University of Illinois Extension's E-Institute program. E-Institutes are part of the larger local government information and education network, which is the Extension's ongoing effort to provide pertinent information to elected and appointed officials around the state of Illinois. This webinar will be recorded and posted on the Local Government Information and Education Network webpage, as Amy pointed out on the last slide, web.extension.illinois.edu/LGIEN. Amy, back to you.
Thanks, Jordan. So we're really pleased from the University of Illinois Extension to be able to offer you community and economic development services and working with communities to improve the quality of life throughout Illinois. So let's get to the speakers. We appreciate them being here and bringing you their expertise on this subject matter. First speaker today is Nick Hayward, and he has been a planner with Tri-County Regional Planning Commission in Peoria, Illinois since 2006. His planning experience ranges from zoning review to environmental planning to developing three-dimensional visualization software. He has led comprehensive planning processes from communities and counties in central Illinois, and his work on a regional stormwater management plan for Tri-County region won an award from the American Planning Association's Illinois chapter in 2009. He is currently managing the completion of a regional planning process funded by the HUD Sustainable Communities Regional Planning Program. Scott Goldstein is a principal with TESCA Associates Incorporated, a community planning and landscape architectural firm based in Evanston and Plainfield, Illinois. His work spans from neighborhood planning to economic development with a specialty in community development. Past projects have included fiscal analysis for Trammell Crow and the Edward R. James Companies, as well as plans from downtown Northbrook to the west side of Bloomington, Illinois, and from Albany Park to Washington Park in the city of Chicago. Prior to joining TESCA in 2007, he worked at the Metropolitan Planning Council for 12 years. He currently serves as Public Policy Chair for the Urban Land Institute Chicago and chairs the Wilmette Plan Commission. So to start off the presentation today, we have Nick Hayward. Nick, thanks so much for joining us, and we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Amy and Jordan, for having us on the webinar today. And good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. Again, my name is Nick Hayward, and the purpose of today's webinar is to present to you the Fiscal Calculator. The Fiscal Calculator is a spreadsheet-based tool that was developed to enable units of government in the Tri-County region to estimate the fiscal impact of different land development projects. We hope you'll find this information useful today as you discuss and consider fiscal impact analysis of land development in your community. And then we also hope that today's webinar will be helpful in enabling you to have discussions in your community about the fiscal impact of growth and about policies that can promote sound land use development and fiscal responsibility. Again, we're discussing the Fiscal Calculator today, and the Fiscal Calculator for the Tri-County region originated with an effort pursued by Peoria County in 2009. Peoria County developed a similar tool in 2009 to enable policymakers to gain a better understanding of the fiscal impacts of land development. So the effort to create the Fiscal Calculator essentially expanded the work that was done by Peoria County and essentially made the Fiscal Calculator available to counties, municipalities, and school districts in the entire Tri-County region. So again, the Fiscal Calculator was developed to help enable an understanding of the fiscal impact of growth for different units of government. Later on in our presentation today, we'll discuss a similar tool, a tool that we call the Fiscal Mapper, which is a GIS mapping-based tool that enables the user to draw different land development scenarios, which in turn enables the user to identify the fiscal impact of the different land development scenarios. So in addition to the Fiscal Calculator providing a site-specific fiscal impact estimate, these tools were also developed to enable a larger scale analysis and to estimate the fiscal impacts of larger growth scenarios. So using these tools, we can compare fiscal impacts across the region, and these tools are beneficial not just for individual units of government, but also for large-scale regional planning efforts. Some background on our region. The Tri-County region consists of Peoria County to the west, Woodford County to the east, and Tazewell County to the south. And there are a variety of land development types in the Tri-County region. The communities of Peoria, Pekin, and East Peoria are dense urban areas located along the Illinois River. There are also smaller communities throughout the region, such as Chillicothe in Peoria County, Metamora in Woodford County, Tremont in Tazewell County. And then certainly there are large areas of rural land also in the Tri-County region. The funding for the development of this Fiscal Calculator came from a grant that was awarded by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development under its Sustainable Communities Regional Planning Grant Program. The Tri-County region received a Sustainable Communities Regional Planning Grant, and our region was one of 45 regions nationwide that was awarded a planning grant in the first round of funding in 2010. So the Fiscal Calculator was one output of that regional planning work, and there have been other outputs as well. One activity that was partially funded by this regional planning grant was an effort to develop a new regional economic development strategy. That initiative was entitled Focus Forward CI. You see some images here of some outreach meetings that occurred as part of Focus Forward CI. Many meetings were held throughout the region to engage new groups in this regional economic development effort. Another planning activity funded by this grant was the development of a regional analysis of impediments to fair housing. And for the first time in the Tri-County region, fair housing was examined on a regional basis. And also for the first time in the Tri-County region, a fair housing survey for the entire region was administered to enable the gathering of information about fair housing concerns throughout the entire region. This planning grant also funded a scenario planning process for our region. This photograph shows a mapping event where community leaders and residents assembled they were given maps of the Tri-County region, and they were able to draw on the maps to present their vision of how they think land development should occur in the region. So these are all different outputs of the regional planning process, a process that was very beneficial for us in the Tri-County region. So back to the fiscal calculator. And in talking about why it's important to understand the fiscal impacts of land development, there are some recent development trends that certainly are not unique to the Tri-County region that underscore the importance of fiscal impact analysis and tools like the fiscal calculator. And this chart you're seeing right now shows the population density of the largest Peoria County communities from 1950 to 2000. And you see in 1950, there were over 6,000 residents per square mile in those communities. But by 2000, the population density had decreased to just over 2,000 residents per square mile in the largest Peoria County communities. That large drop-off you see from 1960 to 1970 is the result of a large annexation initiative. But nevertheless, this data shows that over time, population density has been decreasing in the Tri-County region. This map shows a projection of land development in the Tri-County region if our recent land development patterns continue in the future. This map was generated by LEAM, the Land Use Evolution and Impact Assessment Model, which is a computer model operated by the University of Illinois that can project land use change. You see the light brown areas that denote existing developed land. The yellow areas indicate projected residential development, and the dark brown areas indicate projected commercial development. And so as this model shows, if our current development trends in the Tri-County region were to continue into the future, the result will be development occurring farther and farther away from already developed areas in the region. So similarly, the LEAM model projected a future population change in the region by census block, assuming that land development scenario that we just saw. On this map, the dark blue areas denote the areas where the largest population increases are forecasted. And as you can see, the model projects the largest population increases to occur farther and farther away from already developed areas that are typically located along the Illinois River. So these trends pose an important question. If development densities are decreasing, and if land farther away from existing population centers continues to be developed, what will be the fiscal impact on our communities, on our school districts? And especially given today's fiscal climate of strained budgets and decreasing government funding. Well, the purpose of the fiscal calculator is to help answer that question. The purpose is to provide information about the fiscal impacts of land development on units of government. And it's important to note that the purpose of this fiscal calculator is to provide information. Certainly there are other factors that must be considered when policymakers evaluate land development proposals. But the fiscal impact of land development is certainly an important factor. And so the purpose of this tool is to provide a better understanding of the fiscal impact of land development projects on the actual budgets of units of government. So the concept behind the fiscal calculator is fairly simple, really. The fiscal calculator compares estimated revenues and estimated expenses from land development projects. So certainly land development projects provide revenue to units of government in the form of property taxes, sales taxes, and other revenue sources. Land development projects also require units of government to incur expenses in order to serve that development. For example, looking at a municipality, there are operating expenses and capital expenses that are incurred. The fiscal calculator compares those estimated revenues and those estimated expenses to yield an overall fiscal impact estimate, an estimate of whether the land development project will pay for itself or whether the expenses incurred to serve the development will outweigh the revenues generated by the development. And the fiscal calculator was developed for multiple land uses. So it enables the analysis of different land development scenarios for municipalities, for counties, and for school districts in the Tri-County region. That is the background behind the fiscal calculator. Right now I'll turn it over to Scott Goldstein of Teska Associates, and Scott will talk more about how the fiscal calculator was put together and how it works. Scott?
Thank you, Nick. We really wanted to thank Amy and Jordan, University of Illinois Extension, for hosting us today. Nick Hayward from Tri-County has been wonderful to work with on this project. And Brittany Bagent, who's here from Teska Associates, who had a major role in working on this model. What we thought we would talk about is how would you get started with this? If you don't have a lot of money, if you don't have a major HUD grant, are there things that you can do and learn from this study to help model out the costs in your community? And we all intuitively understand that there are costs and benefits of growth. But how do you build a model that can be used both as a tool for local officials to make decisions on local development proposals and provide input to how to work with your school district, with your neighbors, so you can plan for growth in the long term that's fiscally sound? We know that in the Illinois tax system that commercial development is likely to bring in far more revenue and less cost in residential development. We're very reliant on the local property tax in Illinois. But we also need to understand the full picture. Residential development is necessary to house the workers that work in offices. You need those rooftops, as the saying goes, to support the stores. So you can't simply, as a planner, as we all know, just plan for a retail area because it might be more fiscally beneficial if there isn't the growth in that community to support that development. There's a saying, that you hear the joke, the only thing worse than sprawl is density. Well, in this presentation, we're going to take a look at whether density can be your friend, meaning that mixed use and higher density residential in the right design, in the right location, with the right amenities can actually be more fiscally sound than low density spread out residential development that requires extension of capital, sewer, of increased miles for police and fire, etc. And so that's what this model is really all about. So how do you get started? And there are lots of different pieces of software out there that you can purchase. But what it all comes down to is good information in is going to lead good outputs out the other end. We did this model using two pieces. One, just regular old Microsoft Excel that does the bulk of the calculations. And then we work with Tri-County and Community Viz, which is one of the software packages that's out there, to be able to calculate the changes in real time and be able to visualize those changes. But the guts of the model were actually built in Excel with no custom software at all. And I would encourage you, if you haven't done it already, to start to look at what you can do on your own. What we based this model on was audits. The reason why we used audits is that they're more accurate than budgets. Budgets are forecasts in a moment of time. Oftentimes budgets are very close to audits, but sometimes audits can be different. Revenues may come in less than was forecast. Similarly, expenses might be higher or lower than was originally in the budget. So we went backwards 3 years in audits to make sure that we weren't taking a one-year snapshot that wasn't reflective of an overall trend. If we did see a large increase or decrease, we investigated that further. If you're doing this for your own community, you want to be able to talk to the pertinent officials that are part of your budgeting process. That would be, in addition to your city manager, you'd want to talk to your police chief and your fire chief, public works department in terms of what the past trends have been, and in particular if they see any major expenses coming on in the next 2 to 3 years, because those should be taken into account. There might have been a pent-up need for a new fire station that's been put off for several years, But if there was a development of 50 additional homes, that might just put you over the tipping point. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the methodology on this call, but in fiscal analysis, we often bring the costs of land and services down to population equivalents, and that would be for residential and employment. And that you can look at more, but the basic point is to bring this down to a scale of what will influence revenue and costs. On the revenue side, first starting with the municipalities, we know that property tax and sales tax are really the big ticket items. There's also revenue sharing from the state from personal property replacement taxes, which comes from the state, income taxes, which is on a per capita basis. There's also other revenue, and this varies quite a bit. We found some municipalities, for example, were getting significant portions of their budget on their fee for water and sewer. It might have actually been higher than the actual cost and was being used to support general funding. Other communities had these fees very, very low, and general funds were actually, intentionally or not, were being used to support infrastructure rather than those fees. So those vary quite a bit. The sales tax also varies a huge amount from one community to the other, depending on how much retail they have and what percentage of that budget. On the expense side, what's very, very important when you're going through these audits is to separate operating from capital expenses. And that's not always that straightforward. Based on Illinois accounting methods, those aren't always separate pages in the audit, and so you may have to go through those with a fine-tooth comb, but it's well worth it because you want to understand what your annual costs are versus your capital expenditures. By capital in this case, I'm talking buildings, long-term equipment, rather than debt, although oftentimes these are manifested in debt as well. So that's your baseline information of what it costs, what revenue you're bringing in on a per person, we call population equivalent basis. Now, the other thing you have to estimate is what the development density is likely to be in your land uses. And what this simple chart is looking at is in the Tri-County model, we simplify this down to 6 different basic land uses. And you can see on this simple chart what the average development units and therefore residents per unit and per acre would be expected from these different types of development. Now, you could certainly have more categories in this. In this case, because we're looking at almost 100 different units of government, we came down to these 6 uses. And this was based on national standards, community software, but then customized based on what we saw in the GIS system for the Tri-County area. So, for example, what this means in the first row is that rural development is 0.5 units per acre on average, which means a unit every 2 acres. So very, very low density. You compare that in the middle of the chart, medium density residential, 6 units to acre, and you'll see on the next page what that might look like. So 6 units per acre, which is on the upper right, is essentially a small townhome development. In this case, all of the drawings on this page show you 1 acre of land and how many units on average might be expected from just half a unit on the upper left in rural, all the way down to high-density residential in the middle of the right, which is, in this case, 13 development units per acre, again, kind of a denser townhome development, and then a mixed-use category. If we go forward, this looks a little bit more complicated, but it's really the same idea as we're looking at employment density. And so here, if you look at the lower left, for those of you planners out there, you'll understand the concept of floor area ratio. That means the amount of development area as a ratio of the total amount of land, often called FAR for floor area ratio. And assuming 350 square feet per employee, and the office that we use is a fairly low density office, essentially single to 2-story office plus a parking lot of about 37 employees per acre. And you look at the other types of land use here, you can see the upper left is a mixed land use, so it shows residential as well as employment, and so just 10 employees per acre, versus the lower right, you can see industrial, about 22 employees per acre. So how does this work? There are 4 things in a basic fiscal analysis that you need. The first is, for a given piece of land that you want to model, what is the current land use? Is it single-family residential? Is it employment in the office and industrial that we're looking at in the prior slide? The second piece is you need to know what you're projecting. what would be the new land use. So if you had 5 acres of low-density residential, what is the proposed use of those 5 acres? The third is if there's retail development, because that's such an important factor in Illinois, what is the expected sales of that retail development? And we'll come back to some rules of thumb to model that. And the last is, and this is very, very important, if you remember we talked about before to separate out the cost of capital from operating. And so that if you know you need to extend a sewer line, you're going to need to add into this model that it's not just using the operational costs of that sewer line on an annual basis, but it's actually an extension of that sewer line, so you would need to add an expense. Conversely, if you knew you were going to get, for example, a state grant to support that new development, or state money to defray the cost of the transportation improvement, you would include that as an additional revenue. All right, so let's get started. So if you look at this, again, this is just an Excel format. In this case, we're looking at a small community called Metamora. Now, it's interesting, Metamora grew from 2,700 residents in the year 2000 to over 3,600 in the year 2010, over a 34% increase in population. A strong median household income of $58,700 per year, and even that's gone up 25% since the year 2000. So in a small community like Metamora that grew very quickly, it's very, very important to take a look at what's happening with development. So here we're looking at a very simple model of what the red circle shows is right now we've got 5 acres of low-density residential land that we're evaluating. And you can see right next to that circled red number 5, you'll see $523. And what that means that under the model of existing conditions, those 5 units of homes are producing about $500 of excess revenue over expenditures. So that's a good thing. So it's essentially break even, a little bit higher than that, and that's a good thing, not losing money to the municipality. So what happens though, if we change it, that same 5 acres, but moving on to step 2, which is your yellow column, labeled step 2, you enter the acres of proposed land use. And in this case, we're going to say, well, what if we change that low density residential to 2 acres of medium density, again circled, and then 3 acres of commercial. And you'll see on this page, the next column in pink, the change in operational revenue less operational expenses. Remember, we keep on separating operational from capital. From an operational point of view, it's good news, over $11,000 of increased revenue over expense. But remember I said you also have to look at the capital side. And in this case, it's about $10,000 of capital costs. So right off the bat, if you compare the 2 right-hand columns, the $11,430 compared to the negative $10,248, you're still over $1,000 in the black. So that's a good thing. But let's develop the model a little further. Step 3, we'll say, well, in this development, in this commercial part of the development, we expect about $800,000 of sales. Sounds like a lot, but with a 1% sales tax, the default rate in Illinois, base rate of 1%, that's about $8,000 in revenue. Nice thing, but remember, we're already in the black, and now we're adding an additional $8,000. Now, how would you come up with that if you didn't have that tenant in place? Well, there are certain sources out there that can show you rules of thumb for retail development. For example, if you take the top row, typical dollar store or small general merchandise store, 8,000 square feet is the median size of these stores in terms of leasable space. And they bring in about $140 a square foot. So, coming back to the model in step 4, we already added in the $800,000 of sales, or that would be equivalent to $8,000 of sales tax revenue. But let's say the developer, in order to move forward with this project, is saying, well, we're willing to develop this new wonderful project, mixed-use development, and a new store, bringing in $800,000 of sales into your community, jobs. Isn't this wonderful? But by the way, we need a traffic light. Our tenant is not going to come into this retail development unless there is a traffic light there. There's no negotiation. They're just not going to come in. There's no way we can get this development without the municipality paying for the traffic light. Now the community can build that into their long-term plan, and let's say they're bonding for this, a 10-year cost horizon for that $200,000 traffic light, and just for the sake of simplicity, we're just saying a simple interest rate of 4%. So that's about $24,000 each year for the next 10 years to cover the cost of that traffic light. Well, that might be reasonable. So what happens? So you put that in as a negative $24,300. So what does this all mean? So the left column we talked about before, that the simple operations of revenues versus less expenses is about $11,000 to the positive, less about $10,000 in capital expenses. The positive side, the third column from the left, see an increase in sales tax revenue. And then bottom line, what is the total impact of the development? Negative $15,000. Now that community might say, well, it's well worth it. It's not just about sales tax, not just about fiscal impact, it's also about the jobs, about the quality of life in the community. We're willing to take a loss of $15,000 a year. By the way, after year 10, we won't have that expense anymore. On the other hand, if the municipality was in a stronger position and said, well, we're only willing to pay for a part of that traffic light expense, or we're not willing to pay any of it, we expect you to go forward, we'd be taking the risk to bring that back to the developer. But if the developer paid for the traffic light rather than the municipality, there would have been a $9,000 surplus. So that was a simple example we wanted to go through, and I wanted to move on. Again, we're going to have questions at the end. But what about school districts? As we all know, that our school districts are dependent heavily on property tax. So Tri-County asked us to look at, from the very beginning, at the impact on both municipalities and school districts, with the hope the local officials would be able to run both of these together. So if you had a proposed development, you'd be able to see what the impact is on both the municipality as well as the school district. It's very important. And they're funded differently. And so sometimes the results can be quite different from one to the other. Covered most of this, but I think the important point is, again, we know that school districts like to have commercial development because they get the revenue off the local property tax of commercial development, but they don't have the direct impact of students. Of course, those students have to live somewhere. There needs to be residential somewhere, whether it's in that school district or in an adjoining area. But we do see a lot of push-pull in Illinois communities of trying to make sure that school districts are adequately funded and that development pays for itself. Depending on the community, you may have impact fees that help defray the capital costs of education, of school buildings and additions, but cannot be used to fund operations. I'm not going to go through the whole model. I will just have a couple slides here showing that the revenue on school district level is primarily property tax in Illinois. Depending on the district, some districts get a much larger share from the state. That would be general state aid, other grants. There's also federal funding that's focused primarily on poverty and special education. So depending on the district, you could have up to 90% total revenues be local property tax. In other areas, it might be a much lower area. On the expense side, that is driven almost exclusively by the number of students rather than the total population. So we see lots of instances where developers are trying to design houses and communities are asking for example, houses with less bedrooms because they're concerned about the impact on schools. The big picture in this model, we know we need that residential development because we need to have good housing to support the environment in the community and the quality of life, as well as supporting the commercial in the downtown. We all love to have a downtown, but we need the people in that area to support that downtown environment. And we need schools to do that. This is a similar, these are the same drawings we showed before, and we simply added here how many school-age children would be predicted to be in a development versus in the prior slide, we showed the total number of people. Now, what's really important on here is that the number of school-age children is not necessarily proportional to the density. Meaning, once you get to medium density, for example, you may actually see lower number of students rather than higher at a certain point. That's because families are tending to want to have houses that are designed for families, and once you get to a certain density, you're starting to see a tapering off of the number of students, or rather children, produced by that development. You see that particularly in apartment buildings and condominiums, where you have less children per bedroom and per unit than you would in, for example, single-family housing. Okay, so I said I wouldn't go through the whole model, but you do need very similar information up front. what the current land use is, what the proposed land use is, and any additional revenue or expenses that are anticipated from that development. Obviously, you don't need the fourth item, which would be sales tax. Of course, schools like to have retail development for the property tax, but they don't get any of the sales tax. And so in this example, skipping to kind of the punchline here, this was modeling the impact of changing the current 17-acre piece of land that is currently zoned rural residential and low-density residential to 4 acres of mixed-use development and 8 acres of commercial development. Through inputting the appropriate data, the project would result in about a $5,000 loss, primarily due to demand for a new school bus. Otherwise, the project would have provided over $30,000 in additional revenue, even after taking revenue lost from existing rural and residential property taxes into account. So again, kind of similar to the earlier example, that if you just look at some pure operating versus expenses, looks like a pretty good case. But if you needed to buy an additional capital investment like a school bus, there may be additional expense from this. So again, it goes to the pattern of development. If the development was built much closer to the school, you wouldn't need that school bus. Hence, that development would be more likely to break even than if it was built in a rural subdivision that required purchasing an additional bus. So, Nick and I, between us, wanted to, before we go to a little simulation, we wanted to open up for discussion. And first, why using the calculator can be beneficial for local governments. First, it's obviously important to evaluate development opportunities relative to their impact on your budget. And I think all of you are familiar with cases where developers are requested to do fiscal impact studies in order to evaluate that particular development. But I think it's also important as a planning tool in order to, and this is not done very often, if you're going to be planning a new section of town, do you understand the cost per acre? And do you have a balance of land uses so that it makes sense? So it's not just coming down to the individual project, but how does it add up across your community? And how can that lead to fiscal stability? And then from the countywide and regional scale, how do we grow as a region? In the case of Tri-County, this was integrated into a visual demonstration program that Nick's going to talk about called Community Viz. It's able to show what the impact of development is going to be across a much larger area and be able to show it in a visual perspective. So I'm going to turn it back to Nick.
As I mentioned earlier, and as Scott just mentioned, Scott and his team helped us develop another tool that we call the Fiscal Mapper. The Fiscal Mapper is essentially the Fiscal Calculator in GIS mapping software. So again, the Fiscal Mapper is essentially the Fiscal Calculator merged with GIS. There's a GIS-based program called Community Viz, and Community Viz enables a user to draw a land development scenario in GIS and analyze that land development scenario. So in Community Viz, when a user draws a land development scenario, Community Viz generates various impacts of that scenario, such as number of school-age children, the quantity of residential water use, residential energy use, the quantity of vehicle emissions, a very powerful tool that yields some useful estimates of development impacts. What Scott and his team helped us to do was take the Fiscal Calculator and link it with our GIS system in Community Viz. So now we have the Fiscal Mapper that enables us to draw a land development scenario and then generates the fiscal impact of that scenario on the fly. So to show you some examples of how the Fiscal Mapper is used, let's look at this example. Supposing that we want to evaluate the fiscal impact of redeveloping low-density residential uses as medium-density residential uses in Peoria, Washington, Germantown Hills, and Metamora. In the map, you can see the areas in each of the 4 communities that are outlined in light blue. Those are the areas that are being redeveloped as part of this example scenario. So in CommunityViz, we draw that change, we select those areas and denote that they are being changed to medium density residential uses. And after we draw that change, the fiscal mapper in CommunityViz generates the fiscal impact of that land use change. The bar chart indicates the fiscal change of that development scenario. So you see the blue bar on the far left, that indicates that this redevelopment scenario in Peoria would result in an increase in revenue of about $16,000 for the city. On the far right, the yellow bar shows the result in Metamora, which would yield an increase in revenue of over $30,000 for the village. So the fiscal mapper enables us to estimate the cumulative fiscal impact of redevelopment scenarios for both municipalities and also for school districts. On the far left bar chart, that blue bar indicates the cumulative municipal revenue increase of the example we just saw, about $107,000. The green bar next to it indicates the cumulative school district revenue increase of that same redevelopment example. So as you see, the benefit of that redevelopment scenario for those school districts is a revenue increase of almost $700,000. The middle bar chart shows the impact of redeveloping that low-density residential land as office use. And you can see the increase in revenue for both those four municipalities and the corresponding school districts is even higher. And then the bar chart on the right shows redeveloping that low-density residential land for commercial use, and the result is an even higher increase in revenue cumulatively for those four municipalities. To show another example of using the fiscal mapper, this example shows an infill development scenario in the city of Peoria. In the map, you see the area that is outlined by the black border. The area in pink is being redeveloped as mixed use in this hypothetical scenario, and then the area in orange is being redeveloped as high-density residential use. So again, those land use changes are drawn in GIS, and then the result is that map you see of the units of analysis in the different shades of green, which shows the fiscal impact for those different units of analyses. Now, for our fiscal mapper, we did not have the resources to develop a land use map covering every parcel in the entire Tri-County region. So our fiscal mapper makes use of units of analysis that are about 40 acres in size. So this map showing the units of analysis, the different shades of green, that map is showing the fiscal impact for each of those grid blocks, so to speak. So again, we did not have a parcel-based land use map for the fiscal mapper, but essentially, for any geography for which land use is mapped, a fiscal mapper application can be developed using both fiscal data from the units of government and CommunityViz software. Right now, we're still testing the fiscal mapper, but we expect to be able to use it in the future when we're working with local communities to help them envision different future growth scenarios and then to estimate the fiscal impact of those different growth scenarios. I'll turn it back over to Scott for some examples of using the Fiscal Calculator spreadsheet tool.
Thanks, Nick. And maybe we pause and invite a couple questions, and then we can run a couple of scenarios and show it live using the Fiscal Calculator model, the Excel spreadsheet. if we want to go through some examples.
All right, we have a question here from Brian. Was this paired with an economic impact analysis?
This is Scott. For Peoria County, we did do a market study for all of the market areas within Peoria County. That was a couple of years ago. With this study, different people call economic impact analyses various things, but I think the answer is no. We didn't specifically look at a detailed study of the market and employment associated with that, but maybe Nick could comment on that some more.
So Scott is right. This was not paired with a more detailed economic impact analysis. Our view of this tool is that it's a planning tool that can help us at the Regional Planning Commission analyze the potential fiscal impacts of regional growth scenarios. But then we also see this as a tool that can be used by individual units of government to estimate the fiscal impact of growth scenarios for that individual community or for an individual land development project. So it's more of a planning tool as opposed to an economic impact analysis tool.
Yeah, and just a little more comment on it. Again, something might show greater fiscal impact. For example, the example that Nick was just going through that showed everything in green. Well, the reality is everything can't be commercial, everything can't be retail. So we do need to be cognizant that, again, changing zoning for those of us who are planners here without that market demand will not necessarily lead to the positive impacts we think it will unless the demand is there. So if you do have the resources, combining this type of model with a market study and would be really helpful to inform those solutions. The other thing is if you have specific development proposals, it's very important to do a pro forma analysis of whether it makes economic sense for that development to be built. So I think all of these tools can work hand in hand.
All right, and then one final question, it looks like, before we move on to the examples maybe, from David. How are revenues and expenses estimated? I think you might have gotten to this, but if you could reiterate how you estimated those.
The revenues and expenses came directly, primarily through the audits. So there are software pieces. In fact, the default version of CommuniViz will estimate revenues, expenses. We did not do it that way. The instructions from Tri-County was to base this on actual revenues and expenditures. We supplemented that with survey data and interviews with communities, but all of the data that was used, and this was nearly 100 different municipalities and school districts, was based on their actual revenues and expenditures rather than estimated. And I think that's very important. I highly recommend doing it that way. Yes, it will take more time, but it'll be much more accurate and much more legitimate in the view of elected officials if it's based on the actual revenues expenditures rather than predicted models based on national standards.
All right, guys, do you want to move on to examples? We do have one more question come in if you want to tackle that.
I'll tackle that quickly.
Otherwise, we can move on. It's up to you.
The question here is, is there a fear that the results will bias decisions making away from high cost or low revenue uses to other public benefits, schools, hospitals, artist colonies? It's an excellent question, and absolutely, this is just one element of decision, and I think you're absolutely correct. The decisions should be not made solely on what's going to be the greatest fiscal impact. Number one, it may not be a real project, and so it might be a theoretical vision of, say, a zoning change for an area. But number two, if you do have a specific example of, for example, a nonprofit arts incubator that was just built in the city of Chicago, that's not going to produce a lot of revenue, but may have very important cultural and other aspects. So this is one piece. I will say as a planner, it's good to be armed with this information and, have that information available so you've analyzed it and that you know what those costs are and where that money's coming from. Okay, let's move on to this example, and what I'm going to do here, and you should all see the basic fiscal model. And as you can see, it's an Excel spreadsheet, and what we're going to do is this example in Germantown Hills. And we've got a very simple example here. So remember, step one is to put the number of acres, what they currently are. So in this case, it's 9 acres of rural residential land, so we put that in. And you can see right off the bat about $500 based on existing patterns of serving rural residential land. So $500 to the positive of revenues exceeding expenditures. So what we want to look at is changing that to 6 acres of mixed use and 3-acre office park. And you can see in this model that revenues are greater than expenses, about $64,000. Capital investments would be about $60,000, and so it's showing about a $4,000 to the plus. And taking this example a little further, say there's a retail component to it with $600,000 of sales. In this community, that relates to $15,000 of revenue, and we can see that the total net benefit is about $18,000, and the column U in blue shows $18,667 of revenue greater than expenses. The net column refers to the fact, well, remember at the very beginning I said it brought in about $500 of net operation revenue. So the bottom line is, even if you subtract out what you used to get in benefit, you're still about $18,000 in the future. So right embedded in this model, you can see the bar charts that show the same numbers and that $18,000 benefit. Let me do another example that starts to bring in some costs. So here we're moving to, that was Peoria. If we take the same Peoria example and we add in $400,000 for new sidewalks and sewer updates, that would go in this column here in step 4. Let's say that's for the commercial development, and let's say again that's paid over 10 years, so it would be $40,000 with no interest. And not surprisingly, that would be negative $40,000. And you can see that there's a negative impact of that development. If we go to Germantown Hills, we could do a similar type of development and start to put in the different costs and benefits that would take place. And so what you're able to do is be able to project different costs and revenues and look at these things. Now, if we're going back to the question we said earlier, but what if part of that was not a commercial development? If we go back to Peoria, let's say in step 2, we had only 3 acres of mixed use, and we had a 3-acre park. Well, let's say we didn't have to put in that $40,000 of additional expense because we were able to do it in an infill location. So we can see that in this example, even though we've set a third of the site available for a park, we're still $17,000 to the plus. And so going back to that earlier question, I think part of it is it's not always an either-or example of having a major new shopping center or a park, but how do we plan beyond that small site area for a development area overall, a neighborhood plan that's going to be fiscally sound, it's going to have the recreation we want to have in the community, it's going to have the retail development we need to support the population. And if we go back to this example again, and let's say we had a slightly larger development, say we had 12 acres, and let's say 3 of that, the additional 3 acres was high-density residential. So we're able to really look at that and see that that stayed about the same net impact overall at about $18,000. So that, well, a lot of people say, oh, that high-density residential, that's really going to cost our community and degrade the type of finances we have available for everybody else. Well, if we're armed with the facts, we can actually show in this example, well, not so fast. Based on the existing spending pattern, then high-density residential, as part of this development, is actually paying for itself. To the presentation, and we might have a couple minutes left for 1 or 2 questions, and then we can wrap up.
Yeah, it looks like we've got an additional question here. Does the model allow you to alter the background assumptions?
Does the model allow you to alter the background assumptions? This particular model is developed by Tri-County. They own the model. So the answer is yes, they can change the assumptions as time moves forward. They own the model.
All right. If anybody else has any other questions they want to type in, we'll take those. We definitely want to thank Nick and Scott. This has been a great presentation. If we have any questions, I think we can put up our contact information here. There we go. Perfect. If you have any questions for Nick or Scott in the future, here's their email addresses, phone numbers, contact information. So again, thank you both, Nick and Scott. This is great. We really appreciate your time and working with us on this, and hope everybody learned something. And with that, thanks for attending.